The night Rosalind Vane stood alone in the center of the Thornfield Grange ballroom, with the candles at full blaze above her and the assembled company of 3 counties turned to watch, she did not look at Richard Ashmore. She looked at the room. She looked at the plasterwork frieze that ran along the cornice at precisely the height her mother had specified in a letter dated the 5th of March, 1815. The curling acanthus leaf repeating at intervals of 14 inches, because the proportions of the room required that interval, and no other. She looked at the arched recess opposite the door, where the south window sat at the precise angle that would catch the last of the winter light, and hold it against the opposite wall in a pale gold wash each afternoon at 3:30. She had known these measurements before she had ever set foot inside the house. She had held them in her hands, on paper, as a child. Lady Euphemia Carwell had just told the room, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that Rosalind Vane had fabricated every connection she claimed to that building. That is how this story ends. And now, here is how it began. She had arrived at Thornfield Grange on a Tuesday in October, when the rain was coming sideways off the moor, and the lane from the south gate ran with thin brown water. The coachman who had collected her from Harwick was a taciturn man named Price, and he said nothing to her across the 14 miles, except to warn her that the east path to the servants' door was flooded, and she would need to go around by the kitchen garden. She thanked him. She carried her own trunk as far as the kitchen step before the housekeeper, a capable woman named Mrs. Olds, took it from her with a look that measured the trunk's weight and Rosalind's manner in approximately the same calculation. She was 23 years old. Her coat was good wool, well mended at one cuff, and her gloves had been re-sewn at the left thumb seam so carefully that the join was nearly invisible. She had 32 shillings in the inside pocket of her coat, the last of what her father's estate had yielded after the creditors were satisfied, and she had accepted the position of drawing tutor to one Thomas, ward of the Earl of Carwell, at 30 guineas per quarter because it was the only position she had been offered that quarter. She had applied under the name Rosalind Marsh. Her mother had been a Marsh before her marriage, and it was under that name that Agnes Marsh Vane had worked as the primary designer's assistant on the commission for Thornfield Grange in the spring and summer of 1815. The commission had been registered in Agnes Marsh's name because her employer, the architect Hensley, had been called to Bath that April and had left her to complete the interior plans. She had done so. Her name was on the deed as secondary drafter of record, which Rosalind had known since she was 10 years old, and had first unrolled her mother's copy of the original plans on the kitchen table and been shown, point by point, how a room was made to breathe. She had not mentioned any of this in her letter of application. She had mentioned her skill with charcoal and watercolor, her patience with children, and her willingness to travel to a remote situation. She had not thought the connection would matter. She had not thought it would ever be discovered. She had thought she would tutor a 9-year-old boy in the rudiments of perspective and foliage, earn her 30 guineas per quarter, and keep the knowledge of those walls to herself as a private inheritance, the only one her mother had left her. She had been wrong about what would matter. She had been wrong about what would be discovered. But on that first Tuesday, with the rain still coming sideways and Mrs. Olds leading her through the kitchen passage toward the ground floor corridor, she was simply cold and tired, and trying to hold the 32 shillings still in her mind as evidence that she was not without resource. Lady Euphemia received her in the east drawing-room at 4 o'clock precisely. She was seated in a wing-backed chair the color of garnet, her posture entirely upright, her gray hair dressed in a fashion that was perhaps 3 years behind the current mode, but which she wore with such authority that the question of fashion seemed irrelevant. A second woman sat at her left hand, barely older than Rosalind, with dark curling hair and diamonds at her throat, even at 4 in the afternoon. This was Miss Cecily Frome, Lady Euphemia's particular protégée of the season, whose presence at Thornfield Grange Rosalind had not been warned to expect. Lady Euphemia looked at Rosalind across the length of the room in the way a magistrate looks at an invoice he expects to find faulty. She said, "You are Miss Marsh, our drawing tutor." She said "our" as though the word performed a function, which it did. It placed Rosalind precisely. "Yes, my lady," Rosalind said. "Thomas is a difficult child," Lady Euphemia said. "His former tutor found him ungovernable. I expect you will find the same. The Carwell temperament does not incline toward instruction." She said this with the particular satisfaction of someone rendering a verdict they have already decided. A woman of your position should not be surprised to find the situation less than straightforward. Miss Frome's gaze rested on Rosalind's re-sewn left glove for approximately 3 seconds. She said nothing. The silence was sufficient. Rosalind said that she understood and would do her best. She met Thomas the following morning. He was 9 years old and small for his age, with dark eyes that moved very quickly around any room he entered, as though he were continuously calculating which exit was most reliable. He sat at the drawing-room table across from her and put his hands flat on the surface and said, "I will not draw flowers." "I would not ask you to," Rosalind said. She placed in front of him a sheet of cartridge paper and a piece of charcoal, and asked him to show her the room they were sitting in, as if seen from above, with whatever measurements he thought were roughly right. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he picked up the charcoal. He was not ungovernable. He was precise and frightened, and had learned to present the first as armor against the second. She taught him for an hour, and what she noticed during that hour, without allowing herself to think too clearly about it, was that the east wing's proportions were slightly wrong. Not wrong in any way a guest would feel, not wrong enough to damage the room's elegance, but wrong in the way she had feared they would be when she had first heard, years ago, that the eastern wing had been renovated. Her mother had specified certain load-bearing thicknesses in the original plans. Someone had altered them in the renovation. The ceiling height in the east drawing room was 4 inches lower than her mother's design had called for, and the window above the fireplace was set 12 inches too far to the south, so the afternoon light came in on an angle that put the fire mantle in permanent shadow. She knew these things the way a musician knows a note played flat. She said nothing. She corrected Thomas's perspective on his floor plan and told him his measurements were good. It was at the end of the 3rd lesson, on a Friday, that the incident at the drawing-room table occurred. She had given Thomas a more demanding problem than usual, a study of the Grange's north facade rendered in elevation, and he had worked at it for 40 minutes with the tight-shouldered concentration that she had learned meant he was genuinely engaged. Then Lady Euphemia entered the room with Miss Frome at her side, and Lady Euphemia looked at Thomas's drawing and said, still in conversation with Miss Frome but loudly enough to be heard across the table, "The child has no spatial aptitude whatsoever. It is plain in every line. We do not have artists in this family." Thomas's charcoal stopped moving. His shoulder blades went very still under his jacket. He was 9 years old. He did not look up. Rosalind picked up Thomas's drawing and turned it so Lady Euphemia could see it properly. She said, in a voice that was completely level, "The elevation is quite correct, my lady. The proportions of the north facade are rendered within an acceptable margin for a student of 9 weeks' study. The cornice line, in particular, is more accurately observed than I would expect at this stage." She set the drawing back in front of Thomas. She said to him, without raising her voice, "The west portico needs another 1/4 inch on the left pillar. The rest is well done." Lady Euphemia's fan snapped open. She said, with a smile that performed civility, "How diverting! A drawing tutor with opinions." She turned back to Miss Frome, and the two of them moved on toward the morning room, and the door closed behind them. Thomas looked at his drawing for a moment. He did not say anything. He picked up his charcoal and added a 1/4 inch to the left pillar of the west portico. She did not know that the Earl of Carwell had been standing in the corridor outside when she spoke. She did not know because the door had been 3/4 closed, and his footsteps made very little noise, for a man of 31 who stood several inches above 6 feet. She did not know, and would not know for some time, that he had paused at the sound of her voice, and had not moved again until she finished her sentence about the cornice line. She met him formally that same evening at dinner. He was already at the head of the table when the household assembled, and she saw him first at a distance of perhaps 20 feet, which was enough distance to understand the quality of his stillness. He did not move with the deliberate, practiced stillness of a man who has been trained to display authority. He was still the way a load-bearing wall is still, carrying weight without visible effort. His face was angular and grave, and there were lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with laughter. He looked at her once when she took her place at the table, a clear, measuring look, and then he did not look at her again for the length of the soup course. She noted this and filed it under the heading of unremarkable, since she had been taught all her life to expect that she would not be looked at. Lady Euphemia said during the fish course, addressing Miss Frome, but in the general direction of the table, "Our drawing tutor has already ventured opinions on the family's artistic legacy. A governess with ambitions is a tedious thing, but one supposes it cannot always be helped." Miss Frome smiled at the correct moment. Rosalind ate her fish. Richard said nothing. He was looking at the candelabra. His jaw was like the angle of a carved lintel, perfectly horizontal, revealing nothing. But his right hand, resting beside his plate, had gone still in a way that was different from his ordinary stillness, tighter and more controlled, and Rosalind did not see this because she was attending to her plate, but the footman nearest the sideboard noticed it, and so did Mrs. Olds, who had come to the dining-room door with a message and thought better of delivering it. If there was a moment when a listener might wonder how a woman of Rosalind's intelligence failed to read the signs accumulating in that room, here is the honest answer. She had been told too many times, in too many different rooms, that she was not worth reading. A wound of that kind does not announce itself. It simply governs what the eye is willing to see. After dinner, Richard summoned her to the study. She went with the expectation of a reprimand about Thomas, or about her contradiction of Lady Euphemia in the drawing-room, or about some procedural failure she was not yet aware of. The study was a dark room, lit by a fire and 2 lamps on the desk, and the walls were lined with estate ledgers and a quantity of correspondence sorted in wooden trays. There was a portrait over the fireplace that had been turned to face the wall, not taken down, not replaced. Turned. The canvas faced the plaster, and the empty gilt frame presented itself to the room. She noticed this at once. She could not help noticing it, the way she could not help noticing the ceiling 4 inches too low. A room told the truth about its inhabitants if you knew how to read a room. He asked about Thomas's progress. She told him, precisely and without ornament, what Thomas could do and what he was still developing. He asked a second question, about the elevation exercise, and this was the question he had no professional reason to ask, since a guardian's interest in a drawing tutor's curriculum did not typically extend to specific exercises assigned in week 3. She answered it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the desk rather than at her, and then he said, "He has not sat at the piano since last winter." It was not a question, and it was not directed at her, and she understood that she was not required to answer it. She said nothing. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the wind had picked up off the moor, and somewhere in the east wing a shutter was loose. He said, "You may go, Miss Marsh." She went. At the door, she paused for one moment, not looking back, and placed her hand on the frame, feeling the weight of the wall through her palm. 14 inches of ashlar limestone, If her mother's plans had been followed in the original construction, it felt correct. The east wing had been cut. This part of the house was still her mother's. She let go of the door frame and went up to her room. He came through the east wing passage 3 times in the following fortnight, when she happened to be there with Thomas, teaching the boy to calculate room volume from measurement, or to sketch the molding profiles that ran along the skirting boards. The east wing passage connected nothing to nothing with any efficiency. There was no practical reason to use it except to reach the lumber room at its far end, and the lumber room had been locked since October. She noted his 3 passages through that corridor without allowing herself to draw a conclusion from them. She assumed he was satisfying himself about the state of the east wing. She assumed this was what Earls did with their own houses. She was, of course, entirely wrong about what he was satisfying himself about. The midpoint of the story, if one had to name a moment that turned the axis, happened on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November, when the light died early and the study was almost dark by 4:30. She had brought Thomas's latest drawing for Richard's inspection, as the household practice required, and found him at his desk before a letter he was not reading. The letter had been opened and set down, and he had not moved from it in some time, she guessed, because the lamp beside him was low in a way that suggested he had not thought to trim it. She set Thomas's drawing on the edge of the desk. She was preparing to withdraw when he said, not lifting his eyes from the letter, "Eleanor had told me the scaffold on the east wing was not safely rigged, in the spring of 1820. The silence after this was the kind that asked nothing of her, and she stayed still in it. I had commissioned the renovation myself, he said. I did not stop it when she told me. I thought she was frightened without cause. His voice was level and completely controlled. The control itself was the thing that gave her a clear understanding of what it was containing. The scaffold gave way in September. She was not on it. But the fright of it. He stopped. He looked at the letter. She was dead by February. 3 years. He had been carrying this for 3 years. Rosalind stood in the half-dark study with Thomas's drawing on the desk between them, and she understood, with a precision that arrived from somewhere below conscious thought, that the eastern wing renovation had been the wrong renovation because the original plans had been altered. She had known this since the first week. She had not known why it mattered. Now she did. She said carefully, "My lord, the original plans for this house were drawn in 1815 by an architect's assistant named Agnes Marsh. Those plans specified particular load-bearing requirements for the east wing that were not carried forward into the renovation specifications. I have read the original plans. I know them well." She paused. She said, with full deliberation, "If Lady Eleanor's concern about the scaffold was recorded anywhere, I believe it will be found consistent with what the original plans required and what the renovation failed to provide. That is not a failure of your judgment. It is a failure of the renovation's design." He looked up at her then, for the first time in the conversation. She met his gaze steadily. She had 23 years of practice at not flinching in rooms that expected her to flinch. "I cannot tell you this is certain," she said. "I can tell you I believe it is true. If Mr. Graves holds the original commission documents as a state solicitor, the specifications will be there." Something moved across his face, slow and deep, like a fault line settling. He looked at Thomas's drawing on the desk without seeing it. He said, "How do you know of Mr. Graves?" "He was named in the letter I received when I was offered this position, as the estate's retained solicitor. I assumed he would hold the building records." She kept her voice even. "I made no inquiry. I am simply aware of what surveyors' offices typically retain." The fire was very low. He trimmed the lamp, finally, without apparent thought, the movement automatic, and the room brightened in a yellow circle around the desk. He said, "Miss Marsh." He stopped. He looked at the turned portrait over the fireplace, the blank canvas stretched on its frame. He said nothing further. She withdrew. She told herself, walking back through the East Wing passage with Thomas's drawing rolled under her arm and the loose shutter rattling somewhere above her, that she had done nothing except offer a professional observation about building records. She told herself this several times. Her pulse was loud in her ears. The following week, Lady Euphemia presented Miss Cecily Frome formally at dinner. This was not an accidental dinner. There were 14 covers laid, including 3 neighboring families, a visiting clergyman, and the Fromes in their entirety, and Miss Frome was placed at Richard's right hand with the precision of a surveyor setting a corner pin. She wore a gown the color of new cream and a set of garnets at her throat that had clearly been chosen to complement the drawing-room chairs, which suggested planning of some scope. She was composed and elegant, and when she spoke to Richard, she tilted her head at the exact angle that made the most of the candlelight on her garnets. Lady Euphemia looked down the table toward Rosalind, who sat between the clergyman and a silent young man named Frome, presumably Cecily's brother, and said, with the carrying warmth of a woman making an introduction at a public meeting, "Our drawing tutor has proved quite tenacious, Mr. Hartley. One does appreciate persistence in the hired staff. One must find something to admire." The clergyman, whose name was Mr. Hartley, nodded politely and said something about the virtue of industry. Rosalind cut her portion of the roasted bird into careful thirds and ate each third. Across the table and down 2 covers, Richard's hand was resting beside his plate, and it had gone to the same particular stillness that the footman had noticed at the first dinner, the tighter and more controlled version of his ordinary quiet. Miss Frome was speaking to him about a concert she had attended in Bath. He was listening with the expression of a man who is performing the act of listening while some other faculty is engaged elsewhere. The dinner ended without further incident. 3 days later, Lady Euphemia issued her instructions for the winter ball, to be held in the Grange's ballroom on the 22nd of December, and the preparations for it absorbed the household like a tide coming in. It was in the first week of December, during the preparation for the ball, that the thing happened that unmade everything Rosalind had constructed around herself. She had been in the East Wing passage, measuring. She was not supposed to be measuring. She had told herself she was accompanying Thomas to the lumber room to retrieve a supply of cartridge paper, which was true, but she had brought her mother's small drafting compass in her coat pocket, which was the one piece of her mother's equipment she had kept. A brass instrument with a worn wooden grip that her mother had used to draw precise arcs on survey plans, and she had been using it to confirm, at intervals, what she already knew about the East Wing's reduced dimensions. She had a careful record in the back of her sketchbook, in figures small enough to be mistaken for drawing notation. Lady Euphemia found them there, or rather found the compass, which Rosalind had set against the skirting board at one end of a measurement, and not yet returned to her pocket. Lady Euphemia looked at the compass, looked at the sketchbook with its small figures, and looked at Rosalind with the expression of a woman who has found exactly what she was looking for. Nothing happened immediately. Euphemia said only that it was cold in the passage and that Thomas should be at his tea. She said it pleasantly. She left. Rosalind returned the compass to her pocket and closed her sketchbook and felt the cold in the passage as a distinct and specific thing, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the season. She understood, walking back with Thomas through the passage toward the kitchen stairs, that she had perhaps 2 weeks before Lady Euphemia used what she had seen. She was wrong by 3 days. The ball was on the 22nd. On the 19th, while the ballroom was being dressed with branches of pine and the chandelier candles were being counted by a housemaid named Betts, Lady Euphemia called Rosalind to the morning room and said, in the presence of Miss Frome and 2 of the neighboring ladies who had come early to assist with the arrangements. "I have made inquiries. Your mother's name was not Agnes Marsh. It was Agnes Vane. There is no Agnes Marsh in the estate's building records, and there is no commission she could have drawn, because she did not exist. You have told this household a name that is not yours, and claimed a connection you do not possess. I intend to raise this publicly, Miss Vane, because a governess who conceals her identity in a household with a child has placed that household at risk." Rosalind stood in the morning room while the neighboring ladies exchanged glances. She said steadily, "My mother's maiden name was Marsh. She married my father and became Agnes Vane. The commission was registered under her maiden name because she had built her professional record under it." She paused. "Mr. Graves will have the deed," Lady Euphemia said, with the warm finality of a woman closing a case. "Then we shall put it to Mr. Graves at the ball, in front of the company, since you have raised the matter publicly yourself." This was not what Rosalind had done, but the morning room, with its 3 witnesses and its pine branches and its smell of beeswax and cold stone, was not a room where the distinction would be weighed. She had 48 hours. She spent them teaching Thomas. She saw no alternative. The work was real, whether the rest of it resolved or did not. She taught him to render shadows correctly, to understand that a shadow was not an absence of light, but a quantity with its own direction, and he worked at it for 2 hours on the morning of the 21st with the same precise concentration that was becoming, she thought, his natural mode of attention when someone simply left him to it. He was, she thought, quite genuinely gifted, not in the flashy decorative way that Lady Euphemia would have preferred, but in the architectural way, the patient way, the way of someone who understood that a room had to be built before it could be beautiful. She did not write to anyone. She had no one to write to. She did put a brief note to Mr. Graves, the estate solicitor, whom she had never met, through Mrs. Olds, asking whether he would be in attendance at the 22nd's events, and whether he might have occasion to bring the estate's original building commission papers. She framed it as a professional inquiry regarding Thomas's drawing exercises. She was not certain he would come or bring anything, or that it would matter if he did. She was not certain of very much. She sent the note because it was the one practical action available to her, and she had learned from her mother that a plan drawn on paper was always better than a plan kept in the head, not because it guaranteed success, but because committing it to a surface forced you to see where the lines did not meet. The night of the ball arrived with a light snowfall that had started at dusk and was still coming down in small, precise flakes at 9 o'clock when the first carriages appeared in the South Drive. The ballroom was lit with 46 candles in the chandelier and 8 additional branches along the walls, and the pine boughs had been arranged along the gallery railing with red ribbon. It was, Rosalind thought, when she entered in her dark blue gown, which was plain and well made, and had been retrimmed the previous spring with a narrow band of velvet that had cost her 4 shillings, the most beautiful room she had ever stood in, because she understood its bones. She had stood in it perhaps 3 minutes, near the south window where the light came at the angle her mother had intended, when Lady Euphemia crossed the room with Miss Frome at her side and Mr. Graves, a small, dry, precise man of 60, with a leather satchel under his arm, following slightly behind, and said in a voice that carried clearly to the nearest 20 guests, "Miss Vane, I have taken the liberty of inviting Mr. Graves this evening. He has been kind enough to bring the estate's original commission papers, which I have asked him to review in the matter of your claimed connection to this house." The room did not quite stop. It tilted. Conversations continued at a lower pitch. Faces turned with the careful casualness of people who are attending very closely without wishing to appear to do so. Rosalind said, "That is very kind of Mr. Graves. I hoped he might be here." Lady Euphemia's composure held, but the sequence was not the one she had planned. She had planned to be the one requesting the documents. She said, smoothing it, "Then let us settle the matter. Mr. Graves, if you would read the relevant portion of the commission deed." Mr. Graves opened his satchel. He was a man who had been a solicitor for 38 years, and he had no interest in drama. He found the document he wanted, a folded paper, heavy cream stock, with 2 signatures at the foot and a seal, and he read from it in the voice of a man reading a measurement aloud. He said, "The interior drawings and specifications for the principal rooms and the east wing of Thornfield Grange, Harwick, County of Yorkshire, were completed and submitted to the Commission by the undersigned secondary drafter of record, Agnes Marsh, in the month of August, 1815. He looked up. He said, "Agnes Marsh. Yes, that is what the deed says." Lady Euphemia said, "That cannot be the correct document." Mr. Graves said, with the quiet patience of a man who has been corrected incorrectly before, "It is the deed of commission. There is one. This is it." Lady Euphemia said, "The woman's married name was Vane. She had no professional standing under the name Marsh." Mr. Graves said, "The deed was registered under the name Marsh in 1815. The deed does not concern itself with subsequent changes in personal circumstance. This is a commission record, Lady Carwell, not a parish register." The room was very quiet now. The 46 candles were very steady in their branches. The snowfall outside the south windows was a soft, continuous movement, white against the dark. She did not hear him cross the room. She had not been watching the door, because she had been watching Mr. Graves, and she had been watching Lady Euphemia's face go through several expressions in succession, the last of which was the particular look of a person who has reached the end of a script and found no further lines. When she became aware that Richard was standing beside her, he was simply there, the way a wall is simply there, without drama or announcement. He said, to the room and to no one and to her, in a voice that was level and clear and not raised by a single degree, "Thornfield Grange was built from Agnes Marsh's plans. Her daughter has been in these rooms for 6 weeks and has not claimed a single credit for it. That is the kind of character this house has been fortunate enough to contain." He looked at Lady Euphemia. He said, "Thank you, Mr. Graves." It was not a long speech. The shorter the line, in a room that size, the more it weighs. Lady Euphemia's fan, which she had been holding at its usual measured height, lowered by approximately 3 inches. This was, in the context of her bearing, a significant concession. She said after a moment, "I was not aware of the maiden name registration." She said it to the room generally, which was the only way she could say it and retain the shape of her dignity, and the room accepted this as sufficient. Miss Frome withdrew 2 steps toward the refreshment table, which was the correct movement for a person removing herself from a field. Around them, the conversations restarted, not identical to what they had been before, but restarted. Mr. Graves closed his satchel with a small, efficient snap and caught Rosalind's eye and gave her the nod of a man who has done what he came to do and is now free to have a glass of wine. He was, she thought, a very good solicitor. She became aware that her hands were steady. She had not known until this moment whether they would be. They were, in fact, completely steady, one holding the small glass she had been given on arrival and had not drunk from, one hanging at her side. She thought her mother would have found this gratifying. Richard said to her, and not to the room, "Your mother specified the window heights." She said, "Yes." "I have wondered," he said, "since Eleanor told me something was wrong with the renovation, why the original plans were not consulted. Mr. Graves should have had them." "He did?" Rosalind said. He brought them tonight. The corner of his mouth moved, very slightly, in a way that was not quite a smile, but was the closest approach to one she had observed in the 6 weeks of her residence at Thornfield Grange. He said, "So he did." They stood side by side at the south window, the snow coming down steadily beyond the glass, the room resuming itself around them, the candles burning at their even 46 points, and she understood, with a clarity that she associated with the moment a correct measurement resolves an unclear plan, that he was not going to say anything else public. The public reversal was complete. What came next, if it came at all, would be quieter than this and more private, and she was not going to hurry it by a single word. The ball continued for 2 more hours. Thomas, who had been permitted to watch from the gallery for the first half hour, had been taken back to bed by Mrs. Olds at 10 o'clock. Rosalind danced twice, with the clergyman Mr. Hartley and with young Frome, who proved to be less silent when dancing than when seated at dinner, and who was actually quite pleasant when not arranged by his family's expectations. She did not dance with Richard. He watched her dance with young Frome from across the room in the particular still way she had learned to distinguish from all his other kinds of stillness, and she noted it and felt the information of it register somewhere below deliberate thought. And she did not act on it, because the evening had already required everything of her, and she had nothing further to spend. She left the ballroom at 11:30. The snow was heavier now, visible through every window, accumulating on the stone sills in a soft, continuous ridge. He found her in the east wing passage 10 minutes later. She did not ask how he had known she would be there. She supposed that by this point, he knew where she went when she needed to think. He said, without preamble, "I should like to put a proposal to you, a formal one. I am aware the timing is unusual." She said, "I am not in a position to refuse an unusual proposal, my lord, if it is offered in good faith." He said, "It is offered in the most complete good faith I am capable of, which is, I will not deceive you, not unclouded, but it is genuine." She looked at him in the dim passage, the wall at her back, the compass in her pocket, the snow coming down outside the narrow east window. She said, "Then I will hear it." The household did not discover the outcome of the passage until the following morning, when Richard informed Lady Euphemia at breakfast with a brevity that left no room for amendment. And Lady Euphemia received the information with a stillness that was the closest she was capable of coming to acknowledgment, and said, after a measured pause, that she hoped the arrangement would prove suitable. It was as much as was required of her, and she gave it. Miss Frome returned to her family's house on the 23rd. Rosalind did not see her go. By Christmas, the snow had come properly, lying across the moor in long, smooth drifts that reached the garden wall and softened every angle of the Grange's north facade, the same facade Thomas had rendered in elevation in his 3rd lesson, with the west portico's pillar corrected to its proper proportion. The house was warm. The fires were kept well, and the household, which had held its breath across the first weeks of Rosalind's tenure, had collectively exhaled. On Christmas Eve, Thomas sat down at the piano. He had not sat at it, as Richard had said, since the previous winter. It was a good instrument, a square piano in the morning room, and it had sat closed and silent through the months of Rosalind's residence, like a question that no one was ready to put. She did not know what drew him to it on that particular evening. She thought perhaps it was the fire, which was generous and orange in the grate, or perhaps it was the snow outside the morning room window, which lay thick and still on the sill, or perhaps it was simply that he had, in the way of 9-year-old children, decided. He lifted the lid without ceremony. He placed his hands on the keys. He played a simple piece she did not know the name of, slowly and with full attention, and he played it correctly. Richard was in the doorway, She was sitting by the fire with a book she was not reading, and he was in the doorway, and neither of them said anything for the length of the piece. When Thomas finished and closed the lid with a small, careful click, and got down from the bench and announced that he was going to bed, Richard said good night to him, and Thomas went. Richard crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her. The fire settled. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and brought out the drafting compass. Her mother's compass, brass-bodied with the worn wooden grip which she had last seen in the East Wing passage, where she had been so certain she had returned it to her pocket. She had not, apparently, been quite as careful as she thought. He held it out. She took it. It was warm from the pocket's warmth, the brass smooth along the arc, the wooden grip worn exactly where her mother's fingers had worn it. She held it in her palm and looked at it, and felt the weight of it, which was the weight of all the measurements her mother had ever taken, and all the plans her mother had ever drawn, and the room around her, which her mother had designed before she was born, and which Rosalind had come to, across 23 years, and all the distances that a life imposes, not knowing she was coming home. The snow fell outside the morning room window in long, quiet lines. If this story found you in an evening when you needed it, leave a word in the comments about the moment that stayed with you. These stories are made carefully, for people who listen carefully, and your voice there is always welcome.